Hi everyone, welcome to session 5 of Addressing Educational Equity. This PowerPoint is going to be a little different than some of the others because it's going to be less just sharing information and more sort of looking at the sort of concept of disability and disableism and how it plays out within our schools. So here we go. So first I just want to do a little bit of background about sort of models of disability. This is a thing I can get really engaged with, so I'm going to try to be pretty smooth about it. So there's a couple of major models of disability. There's the medical model of disability, in which sort of the problem is in the individual, and so the individual is a problem. The sort of disability is caused by this impairment. The person has an impairment. It's a physical impairment, a sensory impairment, a mental impairment. And so then what we have to do is we have to figure out how to cure it, or how to alleviate the effect of it, how to fix the impairment itself. There's the social model of disability, though, which is an alternative, which says, yes, there is an impairment in the individual. That part's real. But it becomes a disability because of barriers that are in society, an inaccessible environment, whether that's sort of the communication style, or how the breaks for an organization are structured, or what language is being used, or the way that the building itself is structured, or the hours of a job, or the services. You get it. And the barriers are the attitudes, like the idea that a person with disability is not going to be able to do things. The prejudice, the disableism and ableism that someone faces, stereotyping, the discrimination, and organizations who are creating policies and practices based around a really specific sort of set of identities and abilities and skills and needs, really. So just the summary of this from the same place is social model says that being disabled was totally socially caused, so it takes out the impairment, which is the physical portion, from the disability, which is the social context and construct. And so saying the disability is primarily caused by the interaction of the person with the environment. Without the environment, there would be no disability. Whereas the medical model looks at like the person only and sort of throws its hands up at the environment. Like, sure, we can make accommodations for this person's disability, but if they didn't have a problem, we wouldn't be making these accommodations, right? Impairment causes the disability. So then any issues they come across are a result of their... Oh, I can move forward on accident on this slide, apparently. So are these stairs a way that the building becomes accessible? I'm just pausing for you to think about it for a second. I would say yes, right? Because what is easier and cheaper to construct than stairs? What about slicing a hole in the ceiling and dropping down a rope, right? So that's a thing that works for some people. There are some people whose bodies would be able to go up and down a rope. It might be unpleasant for some people, but they could do it. It might be fine for some people. Some people might be like, yes, I can cancel my membership to the gym. Now we've just got rope floor movers. So awesome. I love upper body strength, right? So there's still people it'll work for, and there's people that it won't work for. But that's the same thing with stairs, right? And to some degree, even elevators. There could be someone who couldn't really be held in a seated position for that long. But so the point of this is that we create this idea of what is sort of like a typical body, a non-disabled body, a body that we will plan around. And we plan around it so much we don't even think of planning around it anymore. If you walked into a building and instead of having an elevator, they had stairs, you might notice maybe you've got someone who prefers an elevator. Maybe you need an elevator. So you might be like, ugh. But you walk into a building that has, you know, a set of whatever, like boards hammered to the wall instead of stairs, and you're going to be like, I'm sorry, what is this really what we're doing? Do they not know humans come here? Like, it becomes a really different expectation because we've gotten so used to the norm of stairs being what we base people's bodies around, right? That is usual and that anything outside of that is exceptional. Whereas we could just as easily do that with some much cheaper, much more janky option. So this is an art series by Katrina Camprani, who has created these terrible uh, items that make me uncomfortable just to look at them, which is the idea, right? It's called The Uncomfortable. So that first one is, let's see, let me do this. Yeah. So this one is a lead umbrella. Wow. We do a really good job of not uh, flying backwards when you are using it. So that's cool. That's a big improvement over a different umbrella, but it would be exceptionally heavy. We've got this wine glass. It would maybe not pour out as much depending on if you were sloshing it in certain ways. So that would be an improvement. But you'd have to really tip it and hold your head in a really specific angle to get it out. Not using that is not considered an accommodation, but using a nosy cup is, right? Always using a straw, using a sippy cup, those things are all accommodations because those are outside of the norm. This pot, I can't quite figure out what it would improve. I guess maybe you wouldn't be as likely to bump it off the stove as you're walking past it, whatever. I'm sure, something. But trying to dump that out would be a real challenge. You would be likely to burn yourself, right? And this key kills me. Having this flat top. I think that this is the sort of key that if it were facing the other direction, people might or might not love. Some people might put one of those little rubbery things around the outside for grippiness and for identification. But keeping it this way really drives home how nightmarish it would be to turn it. And I think right then, it obviously makes me think about door handles, right? And how in Canada, they require those sort of long vertical door handles. Let's see if I can draw one. I'm a terrible drawer, so you're not going to be able to tell what it is, but that sort of go like this, versus like a regular knob. They slide sideways. I'm just going to erase that. And we don't here, right? But the reason they require those in Canada is because those are more manageable for a wider range of people. They move the bar, right? Just slightly. People still have to be able to hold it, but you don't have to grab it and turn to be able to use it. You can knock it down. You can push it with a flat hand. So I just think this is really helpful to me to think about what it means with how we set norms and how we enforce them to a degree. Think about it. So these were all really physical ones, right? And there's definitely non-physical ones. So one that I mentioned briefly under the medical and social model of disability part was talking about sort of breaks, like, oh, we sort of set up, if you're going to be in a long training, so like when you were at the training at the CMAIN office, if I had been like, oh, we're going to do 6 hours, no breaks, there would have been an uprising because that's unreasonable for such a huge number of people. But there might have been a person or two that would have been like, oh, it'll get us out half an hour earlier. Let's do it. Sounds fine. But culturally, our agreement is that we have a break every hour and a half, 2 hours, something like that. There are some people who, like I said, don't need that. There are some people who need a break, I don't know, like every 10 minutes, right? And so we've made a cultural agreement of what the norm is, and that's what we stuck with. So what are some other situations? And I guess we can think the same sort of way we talked about it with the school culture, the high poverty to high performing schools piece. So what are the elements in the practice and the policies and the structures and the mindsets that sort of create a norm around ability that we haven't even thought about and we don't even talk about very much? I want to pause this while you write that, and then I'm going to move on to the next slide. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit about disability justice. Like I said, this is a slightly different slideshow than a lot of the others because I'm just talking, the readings are doing the work that I think we need to do around the equity and special ed and the legality and all of those pieces. I think what I'm interested in is when we're talking about sort of universal design for learning, what are we really doing in terms of creating norms and challenging norms and building space where the norms aren't really the point. So disability justice is a social movement that has been mostly sort of built by disabled people of color. It is based around three major ideas: inclusion, equity, and access. So inclusion is full respect of differences and inclusion of people with disabilities at every level, not just in a basic way. Equity, the people with disabilities are full and equal members in the community on their own terms. So not just within the sort of able-bodied neurotypical approach, but overall on their own terms. And access, barrier-free opportunities. If we're thinking about that social model, right? Like that's where the disability comes in, for people with disabilities to participate in all aspects of life, their community, and their society. So in this, when we're looking at social model, disability becomes a political term, right? It becomes a term that's looking at power, of how the society creates this disabling of people. So this I just think is interesting to look at because it's talking about how people with disabilities have to be at the center of disability justice, and it has to be a cross-disability movement. That the very first part of it is about people with a variety of disabilities connecting with and supporting themselves and each other, self-care, safe spaces, and doing our own work. Everything else comes out of that. Creating values, the self-determination, the interdependence, the collaboration with other communities, disability identity and culture, defining your allies and defining ableism, and figuring out rights and etiquette and awareness, and having really hard self-analysis around things that are related to disability but aren't disability issues in some like really basic way. Access and accessibility and pride and history and power sharing, all of that is essential and has to work together, but all of it has to come from people with disabilities responding to their own needs and each other's needs at the center, right? Like we have to be right there in the middle before the rest of this can happen. So neurodiversity is where probably a lot of us have heard. So it's this idea that neurological differences are to be as recognized and respected just like other human variation. I think there's a fair question to be asked about whether other human variations are fully respected, but I think part of the basis of neurodiversity is that they should be. So this has to do with autism, but not just autism, right? There's like ADHD, there's dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's. Many people consider a lot of mental illness diagnoses as part of neurodiversity. So it advocates for viewing these as a variation rather than a disease. And also is about not just figuring out how to include people who are not neurotypical in neurotypical culture on the terms of neurotypical people, but also figuring out how to make space that everyone can access on their own terms, supporting autistic people as autistic people, supporting people with ADHD as people with ADHD. And I think a lot of the identity piece here comes around autistic people, and sort of I think there's something to be said about the fact that that is usually an identity first language disability. So many disabilities use people first language, right? Like people with Down syndrome, people who use wheelchairs. But autistic people have been very clear in a lot of situations, obviously everyone is different, about requesting autism first language because autism is such a central element for autistic people, for many of them, like how they see the world, how they understand the world, and how they engage with the world. So that's just a quick note on that. So one other thing that's a quick language note is that we don't describe individual people as neurodiverse, right? Everyone's a single person. You can't be a diverse person. I'd love to have that just a minute to also say you don't describe an individual person as diverse, period. Person of color, person of color. Like queer person, queer person. No one is a diverse person. Diversity only comes within a group. So neurotypical would be people who are not neurodivergent, and then neuroatypical, neurominority, and neurodivergent are all pretty much synonyms for the groups of people we talked about on the last slide. Autistic people, people with ADHD, people with mental illness, people with specific learning disabilities. I just wanted to read this out loud because I love this. It's from Institute for the Study of the Neurologically Typical, which is part of autistics.org. And this is called the DSN, which some of us might notice as a nod to the DSM. So here we go. Neurotypical syndrome is a neurobiological disorder characterized by preoccupation with social concerns, delusions of superiority, and obsession with conformity. Neurotypical individuals often assume that their experience of the world is either the only one or the only correct one. Neurotypicals find it difficult to be alone. Neurotypicals are often intolerant of seemingly minor differences in others. When in groups, neurotypicals are socially and behaviorally rigid and frequently insist upon the performance of dysfunctional, destructive, and even impossible rituals as a way of maintaining group identity. Neurotypicals find it difficult to communicate directly and have a much higher incidence of lying as compared to persons on the autistic spectrum. Neurotypicality is believed to be genetic in origin. Autopsies have shown that the brain of the neurotypical is typically smaller than that of an autistic individual and may have overdeveloped areas related to social behavior. I don't think much needs to be said about this, but I think it's a really powerful reframe, right? This is what I've been talking about this whole time, like what we've been thinking about, is like, how do we denorm what we have normed so much that we don't even notice that it's there, let alone that we're seeing it as normal? And so I really appreciate this in terms, especially as a behavior analyst, right? Which is what I do for the rest of my job, in terms of thinking about, okay, how are we setting up these standards? Okay, how are we creating the rules that we're asking people to follow? Okay, whose life is this? And whose brain is this? And whose body is this that we're basing these on? And whose life is this? And whose brain is this? And whose body is this that we're pushing out of the center, right? I recommend reading this over and over again. I've read it so many times, and every time I'm like, yeah, huh. Dysfunctional, destructive, and even impossible rituals as a way of maintaining group identity. You don't know me. So I just really appreciate the work that went into this and the ways that it can help us think differently. Okay, so I would love it if you would now watch this video. I haven't quite understood how to do it with recording without making the audio either double up or disappear entirely. So please read this or watch this, and I'm really excited to hear what you all think about all of this. Thanks so much.